Hope is very polished.
Oh. Fellow Toastmasters, guests, friends, good evening. Tonight, I've chosen a rather, perhaps, difficult topic to talk about, but something that I feel is close to my heart. Much of the information that I'm sharing with you tonight is based on a documentary called One Day in September, which is not about September 11th, but which is about September 5th, 1972. Documentary made by Arthur Cohn and produced by Arthur Cohn and directed by Kevin MacDonald. On September 5th, the Munich Games had already begun. It was the middle of the night at 4:40. Many athletes were celebrating, out drinking. Germany was famous for its alcohol and beer, and the mood was jolly, but security was extremely lax. The Germans were desperately trying to portray an image of openness and lightheartedness in Munich. The Olympics following the first Olympic Games held in Germany, which Hitler used as a propaganda message. So the Germans made a particularly strong effort to make sure that there was a feeling of lightheadedness, lightheartedness. Basically, their goal was that people should have a good time. There was no security, basically, in the entire arena. So much so that late night revelers, athletes, were coming back one night, climbing over the fence to get back to their dormitories. But not only were these athletes coming home that night, but there was a group of Palestinian terrorists dressed up as athletes. No one suspected anything. And strangely enough, or ironically, they were helped over the fence by a group of American athletes. Once inside the Olympic Village, they asked directions to the Israeli apartments. These German athletes directed them and said, yeah, they're right over there. And so began the events that I'm about to tell you. Going straight to the Israeli apartments, carrying sports bags which contained machine guns, they quickly entered into the apartments of Israelis. This was 4:40 in the morning, they were asleep. And they attacked one of the athletes who was woken by surprise and immediately knew what was going on. And he was killed immediately. And his name was Moshe Weinberg. And a second athlete came to his aid, which was, his name was Yosef Romano. There were 11 athletes in total in 2 apartments. And the terrorists, wasn't clear this time how many, quickly took control of the situation. And like I said before, there was absolutely no security. The sound of a gunfire went off very early in this struggle, and word quickly spread what was going on. No one knew what was going on, of course, but everybody knew there was something wrong. The authorities were alerted, but there was no immediate response by the Germans. There was no plan, there was no way there was no contingencies for this type of event. It was so unexpected. Nothing like this had ever happened before. By the morning, 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, the Palestinians made their demands. So they requested the release of 236 Palestinian prisoners in Israel and in Germany. The prime minister at the time was Golda Meir, and she said, we do not bend to the demands of terrorists. It's the worst type of bribery. No Israeli will feel safe anywhere. And so, what happens next? You have hostages, you have the Germans, you have Israel. Israel requests that they come and assist They are obviously used to this type of situation much more than Germans, but Germany said, no way, Jose, no way. We'll take care of it, don't worry. And so Israel was left in the background and basically could not do nothing at all. Soon after the events had happened, the Palestinians made a deadline. 12 o'clock noon, if the prisoners are not released, we start shooting one prisoner per hour. Shuttle diplomacy goes on. A German minister shows up. The chief of police shows up. There is one spokesperson for the Palestinians. It's not known how many terrorists have taken control of the buildings. So the first strategic plan of the Germans is to send in a huge amount of food. The idea being that they will need to come out of the building to carry the food back in. So try and find out how many terrorists there were. That failed, completely failed. One person came out of the building and brought the food back in. So at this time, there was no idea how many people how many terrorists were in the building. As the hours go by, the deadline is reached, and the Germans are somehow able to persuade the terrorists to extend the deadline. The deadline is now reached, the 12 o'clock deadline is reached, but extended to 5 o'clock. But after 5 o'clock, for sure, bad things are going to happen, and the terrorists would know their patience would run out. An ITN, which is a British journalist, was interviewed later on because he was on the scene, and he was asked, what was the feeling like? What did you feel like? What was going on in that time? His name was Gerald Seymour, and he said as follows: if you told me back then that Germany didn't have a trained counter-terrorist squad, I would have disbelieved you. Every major country in 1972 was totally transfixed by the myth of utter German ruthless efficiency. The Germans seemed to be like deer in headlights. They did not know what to do. They tried to negotiate, but it seemed to be that they were clueless in knowing how to negotiate the freedom of the hostages. The 5 o'clock deadline was reached, but no progress was made. The Palestinians, amongst themselves, had said, had been trained that if the hostages, if the prisoners were not released in time, that the situation should not go beyond 24 hours, and they should demand a plane to leave Germany and go to a place of their choosing. The Germans, of course, acquiesced and agreed. A bus was taken with the hostages and the Palestinians to a helicopter. Helicopter took them to an airport. The second strategic plan of the Germans was to create a decoy plane on the runway. Inside the plane would be 16 volunteer police officers. I just want to go one step back. Prior to the 5 o'clock deadline, an attempt was made by selecting 38 volunteer police officers. These are officers who were guards in the camp, in the Olympic Village, untrained, ill-equipped. They were to go on top of the building and try and mount a rescue. Now imagine there were 80,000 people viewing in the area with cameras of what was going on. This was 5 minutes before the 5 o'clock deadline. They realized that the same cameras that were filming everything going on in the scene were being broadcast to the TVs inside the Olympic Village, inside every apartment. And they realized that the terrorists knew exactly what was going on. So they aborted that mission completely. Back to the airport, a plane was arranged for the terrorists, and on board was 16 German police, which were just volunteers. They were ill-equipped. And minutes before the two helicopters arrived with the terrorists and the hostages, they made a vote. Feeling unequipped and untrained, they decided to abandon the mission. The goal, of course, was to try and trap the terrorists and to capture them, but that failed. The other attempt by the Germans was to have marksmen, 3 marksmen inside the airport tower and 2 on the ground. This was, by now, it was nighttime, and the idea would be when the helicopters arrived, there would be an ambush and the terrorists would be overcome. So these were not well-trained marksmen. It was nighttime. They didn't have night vision. They did not have radio communication. They were expecting no more than 4 terrorists to arrive. And when 8 terrorists showed up in 2 helicopters, they were way outnumbered. Not only that, but the 3 terrorists who were shooting from the tower were in direct line to the 2 marksmen who were on the ground. So they were shooting in the same direction. So some of the marksmen on the ground did not even shoot at all. Bekitzer, in brief, what happened was that the marksmen were shooting in the dark without proper weapons, without proper training, without proper protective equipment. Some of the terrorists were killed. However, sadly, one of the terrorists was able to throw a grenade into the helicopter where the hostages were tied together, and they were all killed. The following day, there was a memorial service. But that same day, it was agreed that the Olympic Games should continue, that we should not let terrorism stand in the way. Of course, this was an extremely controversial decision, but the Germans did what they did, and that's what happened. The rest of the Israeli delegation went home. The surviving terrorists, the 3 surviving terrorists, were held captive by the Germans, but 8 weeks later, there was an airplane hijack. A Lufthansa airplane was hijacked by the Black September terrorists from a different group. Their demands was the release of these 3 remaining Munich Games terrorists, and the Germans acquiesced and gave up the 3 terrorists who were set free. Israel took care of the 2 of them, but 1 terrorist still survives to this day, and his name is Al-Gashay. His last name is Al-Gashay, and he's believed to be alive to this very day. And in the movie, One Day of September, the producer and the director wanted to have the original characters from the historic event, the Munich Games, and they were able to find him and bring him to interview him. If you are able to watch this movie, it's quite a feat. Israel could not find him, but the producer was able to find him. And he was interviewed, and that's the story of the Munich Games 1972. Make your own decisions about the Germany's involvement or lack of involvement, but I think it's a lot we can learn from it. Thank you.